So I'll start off with a comment on the term emerging contaminant versus contaminants of emerging concern. Officially, contaminant of emerging concern is preferable. And that is because the emerging contaminants implies that these are new chemicals, but most of these substances have in fact been used or produced for decades before emerging as a contaminant. So the term contaminant of emerging concern highlights this fact that it's the concern effectively that's emerging, not the chemical itself. For the purposes of our webinar, I might use these terms somewhat interchangeably today. In fact, I'll probably lean towards the term emerging contaminant, mostly because it's easier to say, so please don't judge me for that. So that being said, emerging contaminants can take many forms. They may be released as is, or they may be a product of a breakdown of another substance. They may comprise physical particles, such as microplastics or nanomaterials. They may be chemicals, biological substances such as viruses or bacteria, or toxins related to these, or radiological substances. A common theme for these substances is that they are newly identified or re-emergent in terms of new data that becomes available or understanding of existing data. This data may relate to occurrence in the environment or otherwise understanding of effects on human health, aquatic life, or the environment. Being emerging contaminants, data are typically limited. The data needed to assess emerging contaminants can be related to occurrence data. The first two on this list, concentration and pervasiveness, would address this, or might be more related to effects of these compounds, such as toxicity or ecological impacts. Finally, emerging contaminants are anticipated to have widespread occurrence at significant concentrations. This may be due to diffuse or point sources, but typically excludes events where risk or harm is associated with a single catastrophic release of toxic chemicals. Usually this is, when we're talking about emerging contaminants, we're referring to something with a more widespread occurrence and potential risk. Next slide, please. There's not a formal process by which emerging contaminants emerge, but there are typically a chain of events that may be followed. So as noted, the release of contaminant of emerging concern or emerging contaminant, this is often the case that they may have been released over years or decades before being discovered. The release mechanism might be direct release into the environment, such as through air discharge, atmospheric discharge, or through the water. Or in a lot of cases, as we'll talk about, a lot of chemicals are used in household or chemical use that might be discharged to a wastewater treatment plant. And these treatment plants may not be designed to treat a lot of these chemicals, especially if they hadn't known that they were present. But somehow a discovery or awareness triggers a more widespread awareness of these chemicals and a need to look into them further. So some sort of a concern, it might be an event that leads to front page news, but a lot of different forms that this discovery might take, depending on the type of chemical. But the next phase then typically involves data collection, evaluating the occurrence in multiple media types to get a broader understanding of where these chemicals may concern and how broad the potential impacts might be. Then evaluation of the data in terms of occurrence, getting a broader understanding of these chemicals in terms of transport potential, the different properties that would govern how they might move in the environment. And then the subsequent data in terms of potential for exposure and toxicity. So then following these stages, data collection, evaluation of the data, creates some broader level of understanding, then the emerging contaminant might be prioritized in a kind of a broad brush stroke sense, looking at how they might be prioritized. Low priority contaminants, they may have had some initial discovery and concern, but after further data evaluation, it's decided that no further action is needed at that time. Some middle-level contaminants might kind of go back through this process again. There might be enough to raise some additional concerns and go back through the data collection evaluation process. And high priority emerging contaminants then might then proceed into the rulemaking process. There's an ITRC Contaminants of Emerging Concern team that is in the process of producing a document. So good information there in terms of the process and guidance in terms of how these steps might be followed for a new contaminant found in a new area. Next slide. All right, so now we'll talk more about transport and treatment in some general context for emerging contaminants. Next slide. So emerging contaminants may be released directly into the environment via atmospheric discharge or water or some other mechanism. And as mentioned, a common release mechanism for emerging contaminants may involve emerging contaminants being present in domestic or commercial water and then discharged to a wastewater treatment plant. Ultimately, the transport of emerging contaminants is a factor of many chemical properties, such as volatility, solubility, KOC, potential for degradability. There are many emerging contaminants in many processes, really too many to try to cover everything here. For our purposes in the webinar today, we'll talk briefly about the drinking water process and the wastewater treatment process, since these are two primary mechanisms through which emerging contaminants may be present and may be a primary concern and need to be addressed. So starting off with looking at a public water supply system, PWS, drinking water supply system, and how these might have to manage emerging contaminants as they may be discovered. So stepping through the water treatment process, if an emerging contaminant is discovered in the water source, it often might be the case that if an alternative source can be identified, that might remove the need to have to treat the emerging contaminant through the water treatment process. But in the absence of that, if an emerging contaminant is present in the water used for a drinking water system, can't be replaced. Looking at the drinking water treatment process, generally limited in terms of ability to treat a lot of what we consider to be emerging contaminants. The typical process involves coagulation, flocculation, sedimentation. This is the process through which a coagulation, positively charged particles added to adhere to dirt or particles that tend to have a negative charge. And then through the flocculation sedimentation process, these particles would be removed. Some contaminants might become bound up in the solids, but most of what we're looking at in terms of emerging contaminants would tend to make it through that part of the process. And then through filtration, which may not be designed to treat specific emerging contaminants. That filtration might involve sand filters, carbon filters that can effectively remove a lot of organic chemicals, organic and particulates, other things that might be organic chemicals, but may not be designed to remove a lot of the emerging contaminants. And so an additional filtration step could potentially be needed here. And we'll talk a little bit more about what other types of removal processes might be useful at that stage. And then comes the disinfection process, where chlorine or UV is used to remove any remaining bacteria or microbes that might be present before distribution. Next slide, please. And now looking at the wastewater treatment process, wastewater treatment plants may become discharge points for emerging contaminants through no fault of their own, but because so many emerging contaminants originate or through their use, they become discharged in household sewage or industrial discharge that's ultimately fed through a wastewater treatment plant. And typical wastewater treatment plant processes aren't designed to remove emerging contaminants, although a lot of organic chemicals may be removed through the typical conventional wastewater treatment process. But just going through the process briefly and considering what the fate of a lot of the emerging contaminants that we might be looking at would be, initially comes solid removal through a bar screen and grit removal. So some solid particles, some microplastics at more coarse size might be removed through that step. That's followed up with the sedimentation tank or primary clarifier. Additional solids might be removed through the step, some finer solids, but typically soluble chemicals are going to continue to proceed through the process through this step. Then following that is the aeration activated sludge step, and that's kind of a closed loop process or open loop process with a secondary clarifier. And that's a chemically active process constituents that are susceptible to aerobic degradation may very well be degraded in this very biologically active step. Also, a lot of organic chemicals may partition into the sludge during this process, and then ultimately be pulled out with the sludge, which can subsequently be digested and treated and used as biosolids. But a lot of the soluble constituents, if it's not easily degradable under the aerobic conditions, may then proceed through that secondary clarifier and be discharged. The discharge limits for wastewater treatment plants would be governed by NPDES discharge permits. And so whether or not particular emerging contaminants are covered by NPDES discharge permits it would be a big factor as to whether subsequent treatment would be needed before discharge for water. And then also regarding constituents that may partition into the sludge, a lot of biosolids are reused, are land applied, maybe for agricultural purposes. That is another pathway through which emerging contaminants could potentially enter the environment, as if they survive the aeration process, partition into sludge, and become part of biosolids. Next slide. So now considering treatment processes, this could apply to drinking water or wastewater treatment plants where additional treatment is needed. Also where environmental sites where groundwater or soil remediation is being conducted and generating streams that need to be treated for certain compounds. So there are several off-the-shelf, widely available technologies used for water treatment that can be effective for a lot of emerging contaminants. And so of course, none of these is a one-size-fits-all. For the particular contaminant, we need to look into the different options here to see what the best fit is. Granular activated carbons, typically the go-to treatment approach, effective for removing most nonpolar or organics, can be very effective for, reasonably efficient for high volume flow type systems, such as might be encountered in a drinking water treatment plant, but also available on much smaller scale point of use type systems as well. Absorption or ion exchange resins can also be widely used. Absorptive resins may be effective for organic compounds such as 1,4-dioxane, which we'll hear a little bit more about a little bit later, which aren't very effectively removed through granular activated carbon. And also ion exchange resins, which is widely used for polar compounds, also can be used for treatment of wide range of flow rates. High pressure membranes are also common approaches that can be used for a wide range of emerging contaminants. One key advantage of, say, reverse osmosis is through a very fine membrane and high pressure to drive water through. It can effectively remove just about anything from water, even down to individual atoms. Perhaps the downside of that is high pressure drop and potentially a relatively large volume of retentate is generated that would need to be disposed of. So a lot of the volume may not ultimately be treated and require some subsequent treatment or disposal. But reverse osmosis overall is versatile in removing a lot of CECs. Advanced oxidation processes are also can be widely used. Can be very effective at removing wide variety of organics, of organic chemicals, and particularly may be useful for low biodegradable chemicals or highly stable compounds. An advantage of advanced oxidation versus the others is that GAC and ion exchange, these membranes, just remove the compounds. These advanced oxidation processes actually would degrade and can effectively mineralize most organic compounds. So we could think about where these might be plugged in the water treatment process. So next slide, please. All right, now we'll talk a little bit briefly about the regulatory process for emerging contaminants. Next slide. All right, if the regulatory process for emerging contaminants seems convoluted, there's a reason for that. The mere existence of a chemical doesn't warrant regulation. All these steps of the process really need to be evaluated. And ultimately, the idea of regulation is to protect the population, getting that last step of this chain here to minimize population harm. But all these data needs to be generated and evaluated through all these steps in the process, from release and exposure through effects on an individual consumer or a person who's exposed to these chemicals, and whether that creates larger scale changes within a biological system, ultimately leading to disease, and then whether it's widespread enough to actually create a broader population harm. So the data that needs to be generated needs to consider this from the beginning to the end, and ultimately consider whether cost savings in the population harm, whether the value of reduction in population harm at the end is worth the cost in the upfront steps of this process. And that's kind of the balancing act of these regulations. Next slide. There are several different regulatory pathways that might be followed. At the federal level, these are administered by the EPA. But briefly going through some of the more commonly applied processes. The Safe Drinking Water Act program is the program through which maximum contaminant levels, or MCLs, are developed. The TSCA, Toxic Substances Control Act, is used to identify and collect data and provide potentially some restrictions on new chemicals coming into the market, and collect data in terms of the occurrence and production on new and existing chemicals. The Circular Superfund program is a program through which enforcement actions may be conducted, and site investigation and cleanup may be conducted. Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, both of these involve permitting discharges to surface water and air, respectively, and may involve programs involving sampling and characterizing what maximum concentrations might be allowable in their respective media. As far as state-level evaluation processes, a lot of the early steps of emerging contaminant regulation occurs on a state basis, in part because states can be a bit more flexible in terms of their approach, and we think of states as being the micro laboratories for the federal government. There's really too many approaches to try to cover on how things are approached at a state-level basis, but we do see, as new contaminants emerge, how widespread, how variable the processes and results can be across different states. Okay, next slide. The Safe Drinking Water Act has a mandated regulatory process, and we'll talk briefly about that here. This is the process through which emerging contaminants are evaluated and then ultimately may become the subject of maximum contaminant levels, or MCLs. This is a process that the EPA undergoes, mandated to go through every 5 years. And starting with this candidate contaminant list, which is basically the identification of potential emerging contaminants and an evaluation as to whether additional scrutiny of these compounds is required. And then that's followed up with the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule, UCMR, which is the data collection approach. The UCMR requires drinking water sampling across the country. So the CCL is the identification phase, UCMR is the data collection phase, and based on the results through all this, a regulatory determination may be made. That's basically a yes or no step in terms of whether a regulation would be needed for a new compound. And then finally, the National Primary Drinking Water Rule, or NPDWDR, that's the MCL development process. A lot of opportunities for public review, those are highlighted in here. So we can see there's multiple steps in between each of these multiple steps in the regulatory process. The EPA can also establish health advisory levels, which are non-enforceable levels, if they want to provide some sort of a benchmark for comparison as they're proceeding through this process with a new set of compounds. Next slide. So just a quick overview of what the CCLs list has looked like. There's been 5 iterations going back to the late 90s, quite a large number of chemicals evaluated each time through. Next slide. And looking at the UCMRs, also 5 iterations of that, but kind of quick overview here of what the different chemicals, up to 30 chemicals through each iteration of the UCMR program. And the UCMR program, again, 5 iterations of that. Each of those involves sampling of drinking water systems across the country. So there's very widespread data that's generated through the UCMR process, and that's what's ultimately used to determine whether to proceed with regulations. Next slide. Following that up, here's a quick snapshot of a few of the chemicals that we'll be looking at in a little bit more detail in the subsequent slides here, and how they've appeared in different steps of this process, the CCL and UCMR program. And I think interesting and worth pointing out that a lot of these have had multiple iterations on the CCL, and may or may not have been picked up in the UCMR program for the data collection. Next slide. And one final note I wanted to make on the regulatory side, the EPA has a useful tool for evaluating a lot of these emerging contaminants that do not have regulatory values for comparison yet. The regional screening levels, these tables are available through the CERCLA website. These are based on what the EPA's latest assessment of the most recently updated toxicity values are, and then calculations based on different exposure scenarios. And so these are tabulated for a lot of compounds through which the entire regulatory process has not been completed, but through which there is some toxicity data, and so some basis for comparison can be drawn from these RSL tables. Next slide. And now we'll shine the spotlight on a few select emerging contaminants, and Kyle and Fritz will take over for that section. So I'll pass this on to Kyle here now.
Yeah, thanks, Mitch. Next slide, Amy. Yeah, so this slide is just showing some select emerging contaminants of emerging concern. Really, the purpose here is just to show that there are CECs out there other than PFAS and 1,4-dioxane and the like, and we'll spotlight a couple of them. A couple of these that are listed here. These are probably some of the more notable or well-known CECs, and we also have listed here some of the past emerging contaminants, and these are chemicals that may have gone through that process that Mitch had just discussed of being identified as emerging contaminants and now are not really thought of to be emerging contaminants anymore, so they've sort of made their way through that whole process. Next slide, please, Amy. So we'll start off our spotlights with microplastics, and this is a class of emerging contaminants that really has garnered increasing attention over the last 2 decades or so. And these are plastic particles and plastic fibers. They're generally ranging in size from about 1 nanometer to 5 millimeters. There is a subcategory of this of nanoplastics, and these are the plastic particles less than 1 nanometer in size. And sometimes they're included in the definition of microplastics, sometimes they're not. That definition really does differ among various organizations. There are two primary categories of sources for microplastic pollution. So there are manufactured microplastics. These are referred to as primary microplastics. Those that are intentionally manufactured or produced for specific applications or for specific products. So this includes things like abrasive beads that are used in personal care products like toothpaste or face cleaners. There's also several types of coatings that are used on seeds and fertilizers and pesticides and other agricultural products. The other category of sources is microplastics that are formed through the degradation and weathering of macroplastic materials. So these are referred to as secondary microplastics. So natural degradation processes such as photodegradation and weathering, or anthropogenic processes like washing of clothes or wearing of tires can contribute to microplastic pollution. Regardless of their origin, microplastics are considered to be ubiquitous in the environment. They're typically more abundant near urbanized areas, but they've been found all over the world, from ice sheets in Antarctica to sea salt, They've been found in surface waters, groundwater, wastewater, soils and sediment, and biota really worldwide. While most of the studies focus on the marine environment in terms of distribution, it's important to note that land-based microplastic pollution is maybe even greater, and some estimates range up to 23 times greater microplastic pollution on land relative to that's directly released into the oceans. Exposure pathways to humans include ingestion of contaminated food and water or inhalation of microplastic particles. There's potential dermal contact exposures as well, if soil or personal care products that contain microplastics. Bioaccumulation and trophic transfer are areas of concern for microplastics, and they're areas of active research. But microplastics have been detected in human blood, deep lung tissues, placental tissues, human excrement. The health effects attributed to ingestion of microplastics includes inflammation, immunosuppression, oxidative stress, potential reproductive effects. But beyond the impacts of the plastic particles themselves, one of the primary concerns regarding microplastics is health and environmental impacts that are associated with sorbed chemicals. So since microplastics are very small particles, they have a very high surface area to volume ratio, and they can have surface charges and can sorb chemicals as they migrate through the environment, or can have chemicals sorbed from their manufacturing processes, such as solvents or catalysts or plasticizers. The fate and transport of microplastics really does vary widely, mainly due to the extreme diversity of this contaminant class. Their transport through the environment can be influenced by a number of variables, including their physical properties like size, density, shape, or chemical properties like their polymer type, any additives or sorbed substances. And so the state of the science on microplastics is really rapidly evolving, and this is likely to lead to the development of regulations as the associated risks become more understood. There is an ITRC microplastics team, and they have a guidance document as well. It's a really great resource if you're looking for more information. In terms of regulatory status, at the state level, the ITRC did a survey in 2021 and of all the states, and the respondents, they found that there's really limited state level sampling for microplastics. I think only 4 states had responded that they had sampled for microplastics, and there were only a few states that responded that they are considering criteria or standards in the future. At the federal level, regulations are still nascent. There are some regulations that do apply. Includes the Microbead Free Waters Act of 2015. And this prohibits cosmetics containing microbeads from being manufactured. The Save Our Seas Act 2.0 of 2020. This provides grant funding for microfiber pollution prevention strategies. And the 2022 Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which also allocated funding specifically for microplastics and identified microplastics as an emerging contaminant. There are other state and federal regulations that address macroplastics and pre-production plastic pollution, and those might ultimately have an effect on the generation of microplastics as well. Next slide, please, Amy. So techniques and best practices for sampling microplastics and analysis are still evolving. And so comparison of data that's been collected from various studies to date is challenging because of the differences in sampling techniques and analysis methodologies that have been employed. There's only been a few methods that have been really widely adopted. The ASTM in 2020 released a standard for water sample collection and a standard for water sample preparation. But really the extreme diversity in microplastic particle size, shape, type, coupled with that lack of a universal definition and lack of standards for sampling, really highlights the importance of defining your data quality objectives before sampling. There's currently no standardized method even for just reporting your analytical results. So depending on your sampling goals, your microplastic analysis might be quantified in terms of mass or in terms of total microplastic count. Typically for sampling, the procedures include field filtration or a sieving step. This is often done in line or slipstream. And for water samples, can require very large volumes of water. Recommendations are up to 1,000 liters of water in order to maximize representativeness of your sample. Next slide, please. In terms of treatment, source reduction is really the first and best step to prevent microplastics from entering the environment. Conventional drinking water and wastewater treatment processes have shown fairly high removal rates from water. So drinking water treatment plants, they can achieve 70 to 83% removal using those steps that Mitch had discussed: coagulation, flocculation, sedimentation, filtration, and combined treatment processes here would typically be more effective. Membrane filtrations also have very effective removal rates, the data shows, but may have some limitations for large-scale applications, as Mitch had discussed. In terms of conventional wastewater treatment processes, they also report fairly high removal rates, but some of the microplastics may still remain in that treated effluent just simply due to the higher influent quantities that are coming into wastewater treatments. Further, the data does show that 50 to 85% of microplastics could be retained in the sewage or biosolids, which then again are commonly applied to farmlands and could contribute to soil pollutions. An important note here is that the existing research here primarily focuses on microplastics, and there's been limited attention given to nanoplastics in terms of these removal efficiencies for conventional treatments. There are a number of emerging treatment technologies that are designed for microplastics specifically. They're in the early stages of development generally, but there's some promising and interesting approaches that are out there, include use of acoustic waves, photodegradation, photocatalysis, electrocoagulation, and magnetic extraction. Next slide, please. All right, so our next CEC spotlight is 6-ppd quinone. And this is a contaminant that has gained notoriety. It really did in 2020 when researchers in Washington State identified 6-ppdq as being solely responsible for large-scale salmon die-offs that had been observed in the Pacific Northwest for decades. 6-ppdq is a transformation product of 6-ppd. 6-ppd and other PPD chemicals are added to tires during manufacturing. Concentrations up to percent level composition to help protect the tires from degradation and to achieve specified safety standards in the tires. 6-ppd is the primary anti-degradant chemical used in tires since the 1960s, and it's designed to react with oxygen and ozone to protect the tire from cracking and from degradation. So when 6-ppd reacts with ozone, it forms this related chemical, 6-ppdq, and that's the culprit behind the salmon die-offs. Research behind 6-ppd and 6-ppdq is ongoing and new in terms of transport toxicology and remediation, as with many of these emerging contaminants we'll discuss. But studies have shown acute toxicity to aquatic life, particularly coho salmon, some other related species, brook trout, steelhead, and rainbow trout. The coho salmon are in particular highly sensitive. They have a median LC50 concentration of just 0.08 micrograms per liter. That leads to rapid mortality. Sublethal effects include impacts on growth, reproduction, and susceptibility to other stressors like temperature or pathogens. Notably, many other fish show lower or no toxic effects to 6-ppdq, including other salmonids like Chinook or Atlantic salmon. Beyond impact to aquatic species, human health effects of 6-ppd and 6-ppdq are areas of active research. The parent compound 6-ppd is well documented as a skin sensitizer, and it's listed by the European Chemicals Agency as a Category 1 reproductive toxicant. 6-ppdq is predicted to cause oxidative stress and liver lipid accumulation. The primary transport model shown on this cartoon that's on your screen now involves tire wear particles that contain 6-ppd and 6-ppdq being transported by stormwater or air into surface waters or sediments. There's a potential routes of exposure that also include inhalation, particularly near high traffic areas. Exposure via drinking water and bioaccumulation effects are still areas of active research. In terms of distribution, it's been found in various environmental media, stormwater, surface water, sediment soils, rubber products, and even human urine. Elevated concentrations in surface waters are highest typically during or immediately following rain or snowmelt events. And 6-ppdq is expected to sorb to sediments and particles, and that could prolong the duration of elevated concentrations in surface waters. EPA screening levels do not exist for 6-ppd or 6-ppdq, but the EPA is in the process of developing draft screening values for these two compounds to protect sensitive salmon species and other aquatic life. California and Washington State are really leading the charge in terms of regulatory actions. They're developing action plans, allocating funding research, they're regulating the use of 6-ppd in motor vehicles. The states of Maine and Minnesota have identified 6-ppd as chemicals of concern. There's simultaneous federal action plans that are addressing concerns of 6-ppd and 6-ppdq, as well as other chemicals, in terms of exposure pathway through tire crumb rubber that's used in synthetic fields. Next slide, please. Environmental sampling for 6-ppd and 6-ppdq can be challenging, primarily due to the low and intermittent concentrations of these chemicals. So passive sampling technologies are being developed to address that issue. There are commercial and research laboratories that can test for 6-ppdq in water, and the US EPA is developing a Clean Water Act 1600 series test method for detection in surface and stormwater. There's limited studies that on the effectiveness of conventional wastewater treatment plants for removing 6-ppd and 6-ppdq, but the fact that these chemicals tend to sorb to organics really raises questions about their accumulation in sludges and biosolids. One of the primary areas of research in terms of mitigation is best management practices for modifying stormwater systems, adding BMP retrofits to urban roadways to enhance filtration. There are also efforts being made to deploy and identify alternatives to 6-ppd in tires in order to reduce or eliminate 6-ppdq in the environment. So states like California and Washington State are pursuing policies to promote alternative tire compounds. And the state of California has just, as of last month, begun regulating 6-ppd in motor vehicles via their Safer Consumer Products program. Next slide, please. So the next CEC spotlight is ethylene oxide, ETO. This is a flammable, colorless gas. It's used in the manufacture of many other chemicals for a range of products, including antifreeze, textiles, plastics, detergents, adhesives. Additionally, ETO is used to sterilize medical equipment and certain food products, such as spices and dried herbs, and other things that can't be sterilized by the use of steam. When ETO is produced or used, some of it may be released into the air. This is really the primary focus exposure pathway is via air emissions. Exposures via water and absorption to soils and sediments is not really an expected pathway for ETO. It's known to be a carcinogen, particularly to people who are regularly exposed over extended periods. So long-term exposures to each risk of various cancers, including blood cancers and breast cancer in women. Acute exposures can lead to respiratory irritation, lung injury, headache, nausea, etc. Exposures to surrounding communities resulting from ETO emissions are a concern, particularly from large chemical facilities or commercial sterilizers. But little data exists to show that acute health effects are resulting from this pathway. So as such, regulatory efforts have really primarily been focused on reducing long-term exposures to workers and identifying safe alternatives to ETO in its use for sterilization. US EPA RSLs do exist for ETO in air, soil, and water. They're listed here on the slide. In April 2023, EPA issued 3 proposals to reduce risks of ETO exposure to workers and to surrounding communities, including proposals regulated under the Clean Air Act, the Toxic Release Inventory, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, FIFRA. And they will all apply to emissions from chemical plants and commercial sterilizers. Additionally, EPA recently published a risk assessment that discusses lifetime risks for ETO exposure in occupational settings and to communities near commercial sterilizers. None of those studies found an indication of acute or short-term health risks associated with routine use of ETO at sterilization facilities, but they did find the highest cancer risks are for workers who directly handle ETO over the course of their entire career. With that, I think we'll hand over to Fritz to take it from here.
Okay, thank you so much, Kyle. If you could go to the first 1,4-dioxane slide, thank you, Amy. So yes, going to speak to a few more emerging contaminants quickly at the end of our talk before I hand it back to Mitch to close it off. If one is interested in more than 2 minutes, if you want a 2-hour presentation on 1,4-dioxane, the ITRC team has one coming up next Thursday, November 9th. So if you want much more detail on this emerging contaminant, please sign up for that. But here's the Cliff Notes version. This compound was used as a stabilizer for 1,1,1-TCA, as well as in a lot of different consumer products. But use as a stabilizer is where we find it most commonly in the environment. And based on the increase in popularity of 1,1,1-TCA and then phasing that out due to its ozone depleting properties, production peaked in the 1980s. But because of that historical use, this compound is commonly associated with chlorinated solvent sites. EPA considers it to be likely carcinogenic, can also cause kidney and liver issues. There is not currently a federal MCL. For context, EPA has an RSL, regional screening level of 0.46 parts per billion. So a little bit less than a part per billion, about an order of magnitude lower concentration of reference than things that we more commonly hear about, benzene, trichloroethene, et cetera. And we'll talk about state issues on the very next slide, so stay tuned for that. That graphic on the right-hand side gives a snapshot of occurrence. This is based on data from UCMR3, about 10 years old by now, detected in 21% of US water supplies, quite prevalent out there. Those different dots represent the magnitude of the concentrations, and all but the very smallest size on that map indicate essentially exceedance of the RSL in public drinking water. This is based on sources in groundwater. Surface water shows very similar concentrations, or very similar trends, I should say, as well. Widespread detection and many exceedances of that reference level. Very interestingly, PFAS and PFOA were also in UCMR 23. 1,4-dioxane was more prevalent in that study, yet since that time, we all know what has dominated the news. But we won't talk about PFAS anymore in this talk. Next slide, please. So this is the state map showing different regulatory standards for 1,4-dioxane. A few states have promulgated MCLs, and many of the other states shown on this map have other regulatory standards, many of which are enforceable as well. So even though there's not yet been action on a federal level, taking Colorado, where I live as an example, the state has a groundwater standard of 0.35 parts per billion. So in many ways, in many states, this contaminant has emerged on the state level. If you want more info on this, you can again see the ITRC 1,4-dioxane tech reg document online. Next slide, please. So what are some of the physical properties of 1,4-dioxane? It has that cyclical ring structure that you see on the top there. It is highly soluble in water, and it's also sparingly volatile. So it also does not absorb very much to soil at all. So if one were to consider partitioning properties, you know, you have various constants that compare air to water to solid phase concentrations. For this particular compound, the vast majority will end up in the aqueous phase. This has a consequence of leading to a relatively great propensity for this compound to get leached into groundwater from near surface releases and then to form groundwater plumes once it reaches the water table. 1,4-dioxane is treatable, though the list of technologies that can treat it is somewhat less than other compounds. Advanced oxidation processes, highly sophisticated ex situ processes, those can break apart that ring and degrade 1,4-dioxane, as they can with many organics. Additionally, there's been a whole lot of focus lately on biological treatment processes for 1,4-dioxane. Bacteria have recently been isolated that can degrade 1,4-dioxane as a primary substrate, i.e. they gain energy from that reaction. Additionally, there's co-metabolic bacteria that can also act on 1,4-dioxane. Because 1,4-dioxane is so soluble and so sparingly absorptive, it does have a lot of potential for phytoremediation treatment. Last bullet there, many common elements of pump and treat systems, for example, air strippers, also activated carbon. 1,4-dioxane is not particularly effective for, those methods are not effective for treatment of 1,4-dioxane. The relevance here is that there have been a great many sites where pump and treat has been used to treat chlorinated solvent plumes, with people not fully aware that 1,4-dioxane was also present in the mix. The 1,4-dioxane passed right through the treatment mechanism. So that is something to keep an eye on for this particular compound. Next slide, please. Changing gears, going to talk about another cyclical compound. This is sulfolane. A bit lesser known than some of these others. This has been widely used in petroleum distillation, refining, other chemical processes, can pull aromatics out of other hydrocarbons, purify natural gases. So very industrial usage for this chemical. In high concentrations, it does have effects on the central nervous system, including some symptoms listed there. From the regulatory perspective, this one actually dropped out at the contaminant candidate list back, say, 10 years ago. These other things went on and made their way through the process. This one didn't make the cut for whatever reason. EPA has still set a regional screening level for this. That's 20 parts per billion. So not as low a standard as some of these other things that we'll be talking about. The state of Texas has their equivalent of an MCL, and the industrial one is shown there. The residential is lower, so is regulated in the state of Texas, not to such low concentrations. And given this compound's use as in industrial, chemical, and refining processes, it's commonly associated with those types of sites. Next slide, please. Similar to 1,4-dioxane, sulfolane is soluble in water, not terribly absorptive, not particularly volatile. So once again, this does have a propensity to get into the aqueous phase, stay in the aqueous phase, and can form groundwater plumes as a consequence. With respect to treatment, we've looked at this compound actually at a few of our own sites, and based on our experience, the literature as well, aerobic biodegradation methods seem to work okay. Anaerobic processes, not so much. So in in anaerobic subsurface environments, if there's other petroleum hydrocarbons there, would need to look at processes to make more aerobic conditions. Ex situ bioreactors, for example, moving bed bioreactors such as that shown on the right, those can be a good option. Advanced oxidation as well. And based on the ability to oxidize this compound, some in situ chemical oxidation or ISCO chemistries, those could treat this compound in situ. Next slide. Last emerging contaminant that we will talk about today is 1,2,3-trichloropropane or TCP. This was an impurity in a soil fumigant that was used very heavily in agriculture, particularly in, say, the Central Valley of California. It wasn't the active ingredient, but was there at percent level concentrations, and due to widespread application of these fumigants, has ended up in groundwater. It is believed to be a carcinogen, and while it does not have a federal MCL, it was detected somewhat frequently in UCMR3. The regional screening level is 0.00075 parts per billion. So we're down in the single-digit parts per trillion range for this particular compound. The state of California has an MCL in that same range as well, 5 parts per trillion or 0.005 parts per billion. Some other states have regulated this also. Next slide. And this is relatively widespread in areas where it was used for agriculture. The USGS has done some surveys and detected in 3.5% of domestic supply wells in agricultural areas. And with such a low reference concentration, a detection may very well be an exceedance. This generic graphic on the right is a mock-up of something we've looked at in a different area, looked at pesticide application regulations that are on file with government agencies, and have seen hundreds to multiple hundreds of pounds of 1,2,3 TCP applied per section of land. Compare that against a part per trillion MCL, and you can see how there might be potential for issues. With respect to physical properties, not too much is known about the degradation of this compound, though it does seem to be fairly recalcitrant, not terribly sorptive. As a consequence of those things, can be mobile in groundwater. We have at some of our sites where we work with this found that activated carbon can successfully pull it out of solution. There are studies indicating that reductive dechlorination, similar to what one would use for TCE and the like, that can be effective, but it's achieving parts per trillion endpoints. That's really the challenge there. Similar type of issue with monitored natural attenuation or MNA. There are degradation and attenuation mechanisms. The rub is in the endpoint there. So with that, I will move on to the next slide, and I think we're going back to Mitch to close us out.
I think, there we go. Free to unmute. Thanks, Amy. So wrapping things up here, a couple of concluding thoughts here on the emerging contaminants front. So we've, as Kyle alluded to, kicking off the spotlight section, we have a few sort of cherry-picked emerging contaminants that we had focused on here. There's many compounds out there that are on some emerging contaminant list or other. There's different lists depending on types of sites and who you're looking at. This is one emerging contaminants overview summary from this article cited here on the bottom right corner of the screen, but just wanted to give an overview of what else is out there in terms of what's on the emerging contaminant front. Some of these are new, most of these are old and have been produced for a long time, but a lot of industrial chemicals, even some illegal drugs make this list. Pharmaceuticals and personal care products are a pretty broad category that have gotten quite a bit of attention on the emerging contaminant front over the past 20 or 25 years. They're still there, they haven't gone away. but they're also among the chemicals on this list. So yeah, just wanted to give an overview here that there's quite a bit more out there in terms of emerging contaminants. Next slide. Thank you. One interesting recent development in terms of managing emerging contaminants is a substantial amount of funding that has been made available through the bipartisan infrastructure law, this BIL program, which includes a substantial amount of money that's earmarked for addressing emerging contaminants, particularly focusing on PFAS, but not limited to PFAS in accordance with the documentation around this. So this funding is made available through state drinking water funds. $4 billion has been earmarked for this, $800 million a year to be divvied up between the states as part of the drinking water funds. Eligible systems include public water supplies or private nonprofit types of systems. A lot more behind the scenes to that to look into if needed, and also 25% indicated for disadvantaged communities. There's a summary here on the right-hand side of what is considered eligible projects related to emerging contaminants. And I won't go through this in detail, but really the big picture is funding for a variety of types of projects involving assessment of impacts, implementing a system, and designing and putting something into place if treatment may be needed, and even training types of systems could be a part of this. Next slide. All right, so wrapping things up here, a common feature between all of these emerging contaminants that we talked about and others on the list is I guess that they're useful. These are all chemicals that have been very widely produced because that's what people do. We find something useful and then make way too much of it and don't find out it's a problem until we find out later. But typically these contaminants of emerging concern are newly discovered chemicals that have been produced for a while, and we're still producing new chemicals. So whatever tomorrow's emerging contaminant is going to be is something we're still coming up with today. So it's an ongoing process, of course. As we talked about, conventional water treatment may not be designed for contaminants of emerging concern. For most CECs, there's some technology out there that can be used to treat, but we just have to have some data to know what we're looking for, and systems can be designed and implemented accordingly. Regulations, always a step behind, always trying to catch up with emerging contaminants. So it's an ongoing process following these regulations. And then the final note here that we've touched on a very short list of countless chemicals that are present in the environment. So always a process to keep up with the emerging contaminants front. So that wraps up our presentation.
Thank you, Mitch and Fritz and Kyle. Great information. We all know we could probably talk all day on these emerging contaminants, so appreciate you guys pulling it together and providing a summary. We are up to our time. We did have one question about the slides being available after the presentation, and just want to let everybody know that over the next couple days we will be sending a copy of the slide deck as well as a recording of today's webinar. We did have one question come in, Fritz, I believe it's for you, about TCP, bear with me one second. With the widespread use of 1,2,3 TCP in agriculture, is it hard to distinguish impacts from a given site from a regional non-point source, or sources, excuse me?
Sure. I mean, the short answer is yes. That is challenging, but yes, it can be done. If you recall that patchwork plot that I showed of just all the different application of this compound and how heterogeneous it was, there are overprinting non-point source issues that have been documented, and the USGS in combination with some California Water Board personnel have done some research into that. So there's some academic research out there for a conceptual model of what that non-point impacts might look like, how they're stratified with depth changing over time. So quite a lot there, more than I can answer in this particular time, but it can be done. Would be happy to converse on that some more with someone if they're interested.
Thank you, Fritz. I bet we could squeeze in one more question. For those of you that are submitting questions via the questions panel, keep in mind we will answer your questions via email just because we're running a little bit short on time today, but we will make sure and send out your questions along with answers to you all individually. Let's go with one more and then we'll wrap it up. Do you know anything about graphene, a nanomaterial potentially becoming a CEC?
I've come across instances, I think articles where that's been identified as a contaminant, but I do not know anything about the regulatory process. I haven't seen it shown up on regulatory lists. Doesn't mean it hasn't been available. It just hasn't been seen on lists that I have been looking at.
All righty, well, let's go ahead and wrap up for today. As I mentioned, we will answer any questions via email after the webinar is concluded today. There will be a copy of the recording as well as a PDF of the presentations. We appreciate you taking time out of your day to spend with us today to learn about emerging contaminants, and please don't forget to answer the brief survey at the exit of the webinar today, as that helps us out shape our webinars in the future, as well as provide you an opportunity to submit any topics you'd like to hear on for the future. So Mitch, Fritz, Kyle, thank you so much.
Thank you, Amy. Thanks everyone for attending.